everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Our World. I'm Zhong Shi.
I'm Li Qiuyuan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Over 3 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, an end might finally be in sight. How has the pandemic shaped our world, and what would a new post-pandemic normal look like?
And what does the future hold for the world economy and globalization? What kind of lessons have we learned? Well, today we have invited special guests to join us on this forum, Our World Post-Pandemic. And joining us here in the studio are Professor Wang Yaojing, Assistant Professor in Economics in Peking University. Thank you for coming. And Professor Hu Naijun, Associate Professor at School of Public Policy and Management from University of Chinese Academy of Sciences. Good to see you there, Professor. And of course, Mr. Einar Tengen, Senior Fellow of Taihe Institute. Always good to see you. And Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center of International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Good to see you, Professor.
And joining us online today are Swaran Sen, Professor at the University of British Columbia and a veteran Indian expert currently in Vancouver, Canada. We also have Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University. Rajiv Biswas, APAC Chief Economist, S&P Global Market Intelligence based in Singapore. And Wu Zhiwei, Professor and Director at the Center for Public Health Research at the Medical School of Nanjing University. Gentlemen, welcome to our program as well.
Thank you. So let's get started. The WHO hasn't officially declared the end of the pandemic just yet. They're about to hold a meeting later this month on January 27th to decide whether COVID still represents a global emergency. But I think that does not stop us from talking about our lives post-pandemic, right? People have been doing this for a couple of years, actually. So why don't we start with the immediate impact after China's reopening up? Why don't I start with you, Mr. Biswas? You're looking at this from a distance. How do you see the immediate impact? What's your prediction?
What we've seen throughout 2022 is that a number of countries in Asia have been opening up after the pandemic, such as Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. And in all of those cases, what we've seen is that as the restrictive measures are relaxed, then economic activity picks up very quickly because there's been a lot of pent-up demand during the pandemic for whether it's 2 years or 3 years. People have faced a lot of restrictions and haven't been able to spend in the shopping malls, go to restaurants. And what we've seen in the Southeast Asian countries during 2022 is a huge rebound in economic activity, particularly consumer spending when restrictions are eased. So I would expect this is what will happen also throughout China now that restrictions have been eased, and as cases come down, then I think we'll see a very big upsurge in economic activity. And the timing, I think probably by the second quarter of this year, we should start to see significant improvement in demand. It will be gradual. It won't happen, immediately. It takes time for people to build up their confidence to go out again. But I think that is what we'll see. So improved consumer spending. And what's very important also for the rest of Asia is the upturn in tourism flows from China to other countries, because before the pandemic, China was a very important source of tourism for many of the countries in Asia.
Professor Wang, is that also the similar kind of assessment that you're sharing? Things will start to pick up in the second quarter?
Yes, and I would add to that is that tourism is probably one of the first sector to really go up, and we have already seen the domestic traveling is resuming, and very many people are traveling to Hainan, and you cannot even book a ticket right now. So we're already seeing a lot of consumptions that are pent up that are being released, and we will continue to see that in the quarters. So I think Vietnam took like 5 quarters to go from a 1% growth to 8% growth, and I think China probably would take a similar time, about a year or so, to really go back to what it was before COVID.
A year or so, Einar? to the pre-pandemic level? How soon, how strong do you see the rebound?
Yeah, timing is always difficult. If we knew the timing, we'd be really, really rich. So yeah, I think that's a conservative estimate. I would say you're going to see real positive results coming out after this first quarter, probably by the middle of the year. You're going to see some very, very strong economic signs. But this idea of just consumer spending is not the only part of it. I mean, we're looking at a global recession. And what I really think is important is that countries are concentrating, especially China, on efficiency. They're talking about supply chain efficiency, production efficiency, making things that are better, all right, and better suited to consumers, but at the same time consuming less energy and more efficient in making and marketing.
I do want to follow up on what Einar has just said and take a look at the world economic outlook and how China fits into that big picture here. Professor Mahoney, coming to you now. I mean, both the IMF and the World Bank have rather gloomy forecasts for 2023. The IMF has predicted that as many as a third of the world economies could go into recession this year. Who will have a more bumpy road in 2023? Will it be the advanced economies because of their inflation levels, or will it be emerging economies because they're more vulnerable?
To be honest with you, I think the people who will have the bumpiest roads will be those who are least well positioned to deal with the crises as they unfold. This is the advantage that China will have. It has a political and governmental system that will be able to respond rationally and scientifically to whatever challenges come down the pike. To go back to an earlier point, I think we have to be careful looking at the Southeast Asian economies as possible predictors of how China might emerge from the pandemic. These were economies that were already growing at a much higher rate while China was in a period of transition. We were trying to put that transition in place before COVID hit. The Chinese economy is in a more mature position. It's certainly still a developing economy. It certainly still has a lot of capacity for growth, but we were already trying to do this sort of difficult dance with the dual circulation model. And we know that if we go into a global recession, it will certainly put downward pressure on export-led growth, which is still an important part of that model. Nevertheless, I think we have to look at this in terms of relatives. And again, whatever the headwinds this year, whether they are problems from the United States or a global recession, I'm very confident that this government will find constructive solutions that may not achieve the most optimistic growth rates, but will still be the best that we can hope for, and maybe even a little better than we might expect.
Professor Singh, I want to direct this question to you also on the global economic outlook here. How will central banks around the world maneuver interest rates to keep inflation down? Because what we saw last year was pretty much synchronous central bank actions in terms of controlling inflation. What do you think will happen in 2023?
I think central banks around the world are fundamentally focusing on the monetary adjustments. But at the same time, fiscal policies will also have to work simultaneously to ensure stability in terms of recession appearing and how it is dealt with. And recession itself would mean very different things for different countries. When it comes to China, I assume many people believe that if growth rates from 8% come to 6%, that itself would be seen as a recession, but that's not how some other countries would be viewing. Second, I think these fluctuations are going to be very, very unpredictable. India was growing 13.5% in the first quarter of the financial year, and then it has stabilized now to 8%, even likely to go to 7%. So I think recession is going to mean very different things for different countries.
I think recession risks are very real in 2023, given the forecast we already have, both from the IMF and from the World Bank. We will go delve into this with individual countries later on this forum. But Professor Liu, I want to come to you now. How do you strike that balance between wanting to tame inflation, but then not overdo it, so you drag down economic activities? This will be a major concern of economies such as the United States.
Well, people need to learn from the past lessons, and many times their economy is either overdosed by liquidity, or they are going to be so proactive in overdoing also the restraining of the economic policies. So I think in that, China continued to maintain a prudent monetary policy. And despite of some outcries by businesses, I think this is really the right type of decision. And the other is that how we can really continually get prepared for epidemic, because the pandemic may be over, but the long tail in the form of epidemic will still be there. And we have to admit that our human capacity has limitations in dealing with the challenges from nature. And the other is that we also need to be prepared for some of the uncertainties, because we do not know how the Ukraine crisis is going to end and when, in which way. And then the global energy and food prices are really going through a very bumpy road. And right now we see that it is getting very positive to support the economy when the price is low. But you never know that there's going to be further disruption for the supply chain, particularly in the resources and energy part. So therefore, I would see the global outlook with rather a very much mixed picture.
Yeah, as the global economy's recession risk looms, Professor Hu, do you think that China is recession-proof? I mean, the Chinese economy has definitely demonstrated remarkable resilience over the pandemic, but do you have concerns?
Well, I think I will be prudentially optimistic about our economy in the future. I think the bright side have been talked about so often by the opening up, by the lift of the restrictions, etc., etc. So we can have much expectations about consumption, investment, international trade, etc. But I think we must remember that we are still in the new normal period ever since the year 2012. So I think there are the challenges used to be threaten China, such as the economic structure, such as our main engines of growth, are still there. For example, we will transform the main engine from investment, international trade, to consumption. But if we want to have a good consumption, we must have a infrastructure construction, such as we have to solve people's elder care, health care, housing, etc., etc. So these problems, I think, still need time to go. So I think we will have a good recovery from the pandemic, but in my opinion, I think it will take more time than half a year or a year. There are still a lot of work to do. So I think we need to be prudentially optimistic. Yes, our potentials, our capacities are still there, but there are a lot of work to do to recover our economy.
I mean, Chuyan, the tasks, the challenges facing China and the U.S. are vastly different. For the U.S., a lot of concerns about inflation and whether the Fed's hike rates will have been enough to bring down those inflation. We did see signs towards the end of last year that inflation was brought under control. And for China, the overarching consensus is that China will have a rebound this year. But to what extent will the Chinese economy rebound remains uncertain. Professor Wang, I do want to have you talk a little bit more about the U.S. economy, because what we saw towards the end of last year was that the Fed's rate hikes had worked. There were signs that inflation levels were starting to come down, stemming from a number of factors, of course. We have, on the one hand, smaller profit margins from some retailers and cheaper gas prices, all of them contributing to the inflation coming down. But just thinking about that risk there, is a recession inevitable for the U.S. in 2023?
Well, this will depend on a lot of the factors that were mentioned before, like international political environment, which actually is something in control of the U.S. government. So if they would commit to creating this cooperative environment internationally and lift trade sanctions and restrictions, which they can, this would really help them from going into recession.
Mr. Biswas, let me get your take on this also. People are now talking about a soft landing, maybe, and that's a big maybe, for America, where the economy slows but doesn't go into reverse, given what we have right now, given the inflation numbers and everything, unemployment numbers and everything, what do you think? Will we see a recession in the US in the latter half of 2023, or the possibility is growing that maybe the US can avoid this?
Well, the US economy is definitely slowing down. We've seen in the data in the last few months quite a slowdown, both in the manufacturing sector and in the services sector in the US. And of course, it's the impact of high inflation and the Fed monetary policy tightening that's having quite a big impact, particularly in the residential construction sector. We see the impact of higher interest rates has had quite a dramatic impact on that sector, and there's quite a slowdown happening. So I think there's no doubt that the US economy is cooling down, and our expectation is that growth will be slightly positive, but relatively weak. And so it's on the borderline of recessionary conditions, but maybe narrowly averting, negative growth. I think one of the factors that's mitigating the impact of the higher interest rates is that the labor market is still very strong in the US. The unemployment rate in the US is still at 3.5%, which is very, very low. And we've still seen that payrolls data is showing positive jobs growth. So at the moment, the labor market is a source of, I think, mitigation for some of the other negative factors, because it's helping to support consumer spending. The labor market will probably also be cooling down this year because of all of those factors that I mentioned. But nevertheless, the US economy entered into this slowdown from a position of considerable strength. So I think that is what is helping to soften the slowdown, I would say, that we're seeing taking place.
Einar, why don't we have you weigh in on this also? I mean, inflation slowed down, obviously a positive sign that the rate hikes have worked, but is it going to continue? Also, the World Bank has put the US growth outlook at just 0.5% in 2023. Euro area growth at 0%, both numbers that could be signs foreshadowing a global recession. What is your take on the US economic outlook?
Okay, I want to put a little bit of context here. I mean, during the whole COVID period, what you saw was a divide between the developed countries, mainly in the north, and the rest of the world, and I mean that global south and also the stands. And you really do see a difference. You know, the rest of the countries looked, there was no clear pandemic response by the wealthy countries. The G7 did not respond. The G20 it was very difficult to get anybody going together. You had conflict in Russia and things like that. So what I see here is a real divide opening up between them, and it's economic also. You're starting to see Asia emerge as a regional, ongoing concern with RCEP, the Belt and Road, all of these different issues that China is front and central on. And I agree with my colleague. Professor Mahoney said that the Chinese government has the toolbox, and that's what you see lacking in the United States. They're going to one tool, the Fed. Can you imagine if you only had one tool to control your entire economy? And what they're doing is they're killing the baby, they're taking, as we said, they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The bathwater is, of course, inflation. The baby is the economy. So right now, they're really killing the economy. And not only the US economy, the offshoot of this has been forcing other nations to join lockstep or see their currencies greatly devalue. So at this juncture, I'm not hopeful that the US is going to come out of this very well. This next year is going to be extremely trying, not only because of the political inability of politics right now. I mean, imagine if the US is not able to be an ongoing concern because they won't vote for an extension of the debt ceilings. In that case, you have real issues. And right now, you have ideologically locked in place divisions there that this is a real reality. So yeah, I'm not as hopeful about the US, but I'm very hopeful about the rest of the world, all right, and how they are coming together.
An extremely trying year for the US, also for the world, but there's certain optimism there. Professor Singh, do you share the same kind of concerns or optimisms? I mean, how can China's reopening contribute to global recovery?
China definitely, is world's largest trading nation. So whatever happens in China in terms of opening or closing of borders would not just have impact on Chinese economy, but I assume on rest of the world economy as well. So that has tremendous significance in that sense. But it's a difficult choice to make for any country. Life is important. So I understand that for a short term, the policy of total lockdowns can be understood, but it impacts on the livelihood if you save lives. And then, of course, beyond a point, one has to begin to take a call on whether countries should open up, and that's what China has done now in that sense. So it's a very delicate balance between life and livelihood in that sense for China, and likewise, it has an impact on rest of the world. I think what the lessons that world is learning now in terms of how to ensure that this kind of hit does not happen next time is to recalibrate, reorganize the supply lines, production lines, value lines, to avoid too much dependence on one region, one country, or one part of the world. Because if that part of the world gets impacted, then of course, the supply lines come into complete disruption. So that is another kind of a debate which would lead to some kind of recalibrating of global supply chains, etc. But when it comes to China, I think the China has shown that, for example, we faced similar difficulties in global slowdown in 2008 as well. And then there was talk of how the global economy is rebound from there. China has showcased that it has capacity to sort of recover from difficulties by state intervention, and primarily focusing on domestic infrastructure, domestic market, domestic consumption production itself can help it kind of grow. But my fear and concern, as Einar mentioned, from the global slowdown impacting United States into slowing down its economy, and Rajiv also mentioned the same thing. What we are noticing here is that in the context of Ukraine war continuing, there is going to be then perhaps focus on looking at weapons exports. So, only recently, United States for this year has cleared $858 billion of defense budget. But you have seen that repeatedly, one after another, to Eastern Europe, to Ukraine, to Pakistan, to Taiwan, Biden administration has been allowing some kind of packages of arms exports. So military industrial complex would become a kind of a focus area in that sense to rebound exports of United States, and that may not be a good sign. The latest is Japan is trying to buy Tomahawks, and I think for this year's proposed budget, they have already assigned $1.58 billion to buy Tomahawks, which is unprecedented. It's a counter-attack weapon, and I think, if you look at the two reports that Japan had in December, national security strategy, national defense strategy, they want to double their defense expenditure. So, defense exports, therefore, could be an area where United States will then begin to focus if it faces larger slowdown in economic growth rates. And that may not be a good sign. I think the focus has to be much more on development rather than defense. And that kind of slowdown of economy in the United States could create trends which could be really counterproductive.
It's really difficult to predict in 2023 because so many factors can change in the blink of an eye. We all learned that the hard way last year with those geopolitical conflicts. And so when we look at this year, and when you asked about China's contribution to the world, I think one factor that cannot be missed is the pandemic trajectory here in China. Just because we have reopened doesn't mean the pandemic is over. So Professor Wu, I want to come to you now. I mean, people look at China for its possible contribution to world economic recovery, also knowing they're fully aware that the pandemic is not over in China. We could expect a second round, a third round of infections in the country now that China has reopened. How will this shape China's economic recovery this year? What will the pandemic at this stage look like in China, Professor Wu?
Well, we just gone through the first wave of the surge after the opening. Clearly, that this is a very significant step for opening policy. I could see that we still have a bumpy road ahead because the virus is still circulating, and there is no sign of abating in terms of virus transmission. Although the virus became weakened a lot, it doesn't cause very severe diseases. One of the issues is that the current circulating virus in China is still very different from what is happening and circulating in the Western countries. So you would expect that a new or the next round of the new virus, which we call the XBB 1.5, will be starting sometimes later on this year. But China is preparing for the opening. Basically, the hospitals and the healthcare systems, the drugstores are stocking up and prepare for the new surge in the infection. So basically, I'm pretty confident that we should be able to deal with a new surge, as we have shown in the first wave of the infections, that we are basically dealing quite well. Although in the very beginning it was a little bit chaotic, but overall we can see that things are going much better on track.
Professor, well, let me just follow up on that. Given that understanding of the virus developing in China, how will it impact economic activities? Because we will not be seeing lockdowns in 2023. Likely we will not see curbs put on people mobilizing in China and economic activities. So with that understanding, how will economic activities be affected this year?
Well, I think the opening policy will definitely has a very positive impact on the economy. As you can see that in my university, the students and the teachers are all thrilled by the opening up. And this year they are all planning going places and visiting their friends, and some are on vacation plans. So as myself, actually, I have booked a number of international professional conferences, which actually mostly in the past 3 years happened through the internet conference. So it's very different. I think overall, this definitely will encourage people to go around to have academic interactions, and also encourage them to go for leisure purposes as well. So I think overall it will be a very positive impact. And you can see that just around my areas, people are just going out, and restaurants are packed. And so this is a very encouraging sign.
Yeah. Now, other than COVID, there's a host of other factors that's also playing into it when we take a look at global recovery, right? Like Einar mentioned, and Professor Singh earlier mentioned, the geopolitical crisis in Ukraine. Ms. Biswas, let me get your take on this. Talk to us about the factors other than COVID that could hinder global economic recovery.
The momentum of global growth has been, of course, affected by inflation in 2022. So what we're seeing in terms of the global slowdown is not so much about the COVID impact, apart from what we've seen in China. The US and EU, I think, have pretty much moved into endemic COVID, so they're able to handle that. And I think we're seeing that in Southeast Asia. We're seeing that in India, in Australia. So I think many parts of the world are already in endemic COVID and are quite resilient from what we see to different variants. So it looks like that, that COVID impact on economic growth is already behind many of the countries. Hopefully there won't be some more extreme variant that changes all of that. But on the other side, the world's second biggest economy, which is China, we expect to see strengthening. And that, I think, are the two counter forces on the world economy. So actually, we expect to see that the Asia-Pacific region, led by China, will actually be the key driver for world growth this year, and will help the world to avert a recession. So I think that is the big picture that we see for 2023.
Let me just give Professor Liu a chance to respond here. Your thoughts on this? I mean, other destabilizing factors as we come out of the pandemic looking ahead?
Well, I think technology breakthrough, whether it's really at the doorstep or not. So that's a quite a question, because it's normally any round of technological improvement can really be there to give people confidence. But right now, researchers and economists are really jitterish about the deliverables over one is, for example, the energy, the new energy supply, for example, the nuclear fusion, whether it's going to be translated into productivity and save the cost, or the biotechnology can really produce the right type of most effective and safe medicine to address either the pandemic or the epidemic. And so investors are really betting on it, but there is still a high level of uncertainty. That's one thing over the technologies. And the other is that how we can really address the balance between climate change versus economic growth, because they do not really synchronize at the same time. And many times it's really means a sacrifice of economic growth by taking care of the life quality impacted by climate change, and particularly for those lesser developed countries. Right now, it seems that the northern countries ask them to refrain from using the coal-based power generation, but they have no other alternative. And so that's really exploitative in nature. And then the reshaping of global supply chain, because right now many of those hawkish politicians are trying to mobilize their political power to maneuver the business decisions and to reduce the dependence on China, for example, and whether they are going to have the pressure and the positive one on those businesses or negative one. So that really remains uncertain. And then investors, we see actually a lot of money running around the world, but it's more of the hot money. And whether investors are going to have the right type of confidence to have a long-term engagement with the right of productive forces. So that's also a question. So much is really dependent on the policies offered by the government. And so finally, I think, two other things. One is the indebtedness of many of those developing countries. And particularly now when the appreciation of the US dollar is there to dampen further their buying power. And that's also going to dredge on the economic growth on a global basis.
Problem small business face is the financing constraint. So they have a lot of difficulty in getting loans. So one of the things that could do is to ease those constraints by giving them loans with lower interest rates, which they can do with their tax records and the past transaction records, which the government actually has. So with all the data and help from the technology, I think the government is able to provide such loans to small business for them to grow and sustain.
Okay, and I want to just add something. I understand about the market forces idea and also the policy. But governments aren't good at stimulating small and medium-sized business entities. Right. And these create 90% of new jobs, 80% of existing jobs. They're absolutely vital, not only in China, but worldwide. But you have consistently seen an inability to do that. So I don't know that you can directly address it. But what you can do is, and I agree, technology. The digital yuan could make a huge difference because it can tie directly into all of your records. Now people say, oh, well, you lose privacy, but you will be gaining the ability to get money for good ideas very quickly at a very, very low cost. I don't have anything against banks, but everywhere I go, anywhere in the world, there's these big edifices and offices. Every block has multiple banks. Now it's employing people, but is it efficient? Is it helping small and medium-sized business entities who want to keep their costs of borrowing low to have all of these sites? I would say not. So I do think there's a happy medium, that there are things that the government can do, which don't necessarily have to be direct, but can be indirect, facilitating the marketplace and the platform.
a happy medium. Professor Hu, your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think we all know that the small enterprises are all privately owned. So what I want to say is that the government should give them an equal chances or equal opportunities. That is to say, sometimes are direct, sometimes are indirect, sometimes are infrastructure capacity building. So I think if we want to keep our small business to grow, I think sometimes we must use the invisible hand, the market mechanism, to give them choices, to give them chances. For example, they will do their decisions, they will do their business on the basis of demand and supply on the market mechanism, etc., etc. So I think, yes, sometimes our government should do nothing on some issue, but sometimes our government should do something actively and positively.
Let's now move on to the second part of our forum
Yeah, why
today,
don't we?
the dent the pandemic really put in globalization, political and diplomatic relations here. Mr. Biswas, I want to start with you. I mean, the way the pandemic hurt globalization really was when it repeatedly soured diplomatic and political relations and disrupted supply chains the world over. And very recently, we've seen China's frictions with its neighbors over how incoming Chinese tourists were treated upon arriving in these countries. Now, as we look forward, we're now looking at a post-pandemic world. We want to repair these relations. Will they repair themselves, or do we need more active actions from governments? A good, an olive branch, goodwill expressed by individual countries.
This is a very, very important issue as to how globalization is changing. And certainly the pandemic was a huge disruption to the forces of globalization, and notably in supply chains, the damage that was done, I think exposed a lot of vulnerabilities in global supply chains that needs to be fixed. So there's no doubt that there's a huge task facing companies to make more resilient supply chains all around the world. I think one of the big strengths that we're still seeing, though, is that even in 2022, trade flows between China and the EU and between China and the US actually increased dramatically. So in 2022, exports and imports between the US and China rose by 28%, the same with the EU as well. So despite the disruption to globalization that we've seen over the past 3 years, nevertheless, I think the big picture is that trade flows between these huge economies has actually risen quite significantly. And so I'm quite optimistic that the forces of, economic forces amongst corporates is driving further integration of supply chains and bilateral trade between China and many other countries. So I think that will on its own continue. There's no doubt that there's some thorns in the side of globalization, with tech war clearly being one of those. But I think just the data is showing us that despite these issues about the tech war, about what's called reshoring of some operations back to the EU or the US, the big picture is still very dynamic in terms of the forces of globalization still, I think, prevailing, and very much so in Asia Pacific because of RCEP, CPTPP, and other initiatives by the governments of the Asia Pacific region that are helping to liberalize trade and investment.
Professor Sin, let's entertain two ideas here. One, disrupted global supply chains can pretty much heal automatically. And when you lift restrictions on the flow of goods and people, therefore, we don't really need to do anything about it. Two, what we've seen in the last 3 years has only proven that those supply chains are really very fragile and susceptible to disruptions. Therefore, we need to strengthen the resilience of those supply chains. Are we even able to do that? Who should take charge?
Argument that markets should be allowed certain freedom to rectify or deal with the challenges that are emerging occasionally, and this time from the pandemic. But I can understand that state need not intervene in micromanaging day-to-day issues, but state strategic direction would definitely be required. We have been talking of creating tax havens, tax holidays, subsidies, technology transfers. That kind of intervention, for example, challenges that flow from tariff wars with the United States. Market cannot handle that. It will need state intervention. Now, when it comes to supply chains fragility, I think this is primarily because globalization that we saw in last 20, 30 years had focused on pure economic logic of looking at the cheapest sort of location for cheap labor to produce for greater profits. Now, that kind of model will have to be redesigned. And I'm not talking of decoupling here. I'm talking of diversification of supply chains and production chains, in that sense of creating multiple suppliers in multiple regions, so that in situations like the pandemic, the supply lines do not completely come to a halt. Second, I think the production lines will also have to increasingly become automated. So automation would be another major area we will notice post-pandemic globalization will see, which would mean that some of the developing or rapidly developing countries which have focused on cheap labor will have to upskill their sort of workforce, in that sense of providing them with the special skills to become really far more relevant in increasing automation of production. And third, very quick point is how the post-pandemic globalization perhaps would focus much more connectivity in terms of digital globalization, in terms of services sectors emerging as much important components of total globalization trends rather than production lines. So some kind of resetting, redesigning of globalization, I think we will see in coming years. And I think worst of the pandemic is more or less over, but it will not go very quickly. I think we will see several hiccups continuing in coming months and years in separate regions, in separate variants. So globalization will come back over a period of time with all the hiccups, disjunctions, but globalization is there to stay, except that this will be redefined, and each of our countries, that is where state intervention again would be required, will have to prepare their populations to both deal with the redesigning of their consumptions, but also redesigning of their production. And in that sense, state intervention, I think, will be really critical in designing the post-pandemic globalization.
Professor Mahoney, can I hear your thoughts on this also? Are we even capable of resetting and redesigning global supply chains? I mean, for the private sector, will they have enough incentives to do that? And how do we go about doing that?
Well, I'm not really an expert on supply chains. I do know that that they have been changing over the last several years. We know that the friction with the United States, firstly, the sort of fantasy of reshoring manufacturing in the United States to avoid supply chains in China, but Asia more generally, but also I suspect part of the reason why the United States was so aggressive in its actions in Europe, and which I think largely precipitated the conflict in Ukraine, was it's always been a target to knock back the EU and to knock back Germany's industrial-led growth. And I think that strategic objective has been accomplished. But we know that supply chains have been moving, or if not moving, then that some manufacturing has moved to Vietnam, to India, to other places. But these supply chains are not wholly independent of China. It's often Chinese capital, Chinese machinery, Chinese companies, or that they are connected to the broader supply chain network. You know, to go back to your earlier question, one of the things that I think we have to ask with globalization is that we are facing two major problems right now, and these problems are intersecting in very profound ways. The first is the end, or the near end, of U.S. hegemony. The post-Cold War unilateral system is in a period of collapse. And this is putting a lot of pressure on the United States to try to sustain that. But with an economy that I think is fundamentally unsound, I don't believe it's in a good position. I think it's a house of cards. And secondly, the global problem of climate change. The science is increasingly concluding, it's not conclusive, but the thesis is getting stronger, that novel outbreaks like COVID do correlate with climate change, and that more are coming down the pike. But at the same time, we are seeing all of these related problems, energy security, different countries playing different games, trying to either take advantage of climate change or exploit weaknesses in our capacity to move towards green energy. At the same time, when our economies are doing well, our energy needs are outpacing our ability to produce green energy. So how do we deal with all of these things, and what kind of role can China play in terms of the global recovery? I think we can see the architecture of this already in place. Things like the Global Development Initiative. We will see a return, I think, in force to the Belt Road Initiative. But the thing that most excites me, and the thing that I think we should really be focusing on, is the potential of the Global Security Initiative and Xi Jinping's repeated calls for starting global peace in Asia. I think that this is the cornerstone of moving forward, not only for solving problems related to supply chains, but also to cooperation over issues like the pandemic as well as climate change. And above all, I would love to see Beijing and New Delhi get their issues sorted out. I would like to see some sort of, in my fantasy, I would love to see a global peace conference, hold it in Beijing or Hainan or Bali, I don't care. But I think the potential for peace and security, and again, the conclusion that we've seen from Beijing, that development begins with security, I think this is the way forward through these very difficult times.
Now, what about international travel and tourism, Professor Hu? I mean, movements are now coming back across the globe. People are on the move again. We're seeing a rebound in tourism and travel. But how will post-pandemic tourism and travel look like? What kind of problems should we watch out for? What could be on high demand?
Well, I think from the long-term point of view, we will say that after the lift of the restriction of travel, I think international travel and tourism will come back to a certain level like it before the pandemic. But as we all know that right now, some countries are adding special restrictions to China's tourist outbound, for example, the South Korea. And I think before the pandemic, if we could see the statistics, South Korea is the major target of China's tourists. But right now, I saw statistics only several days ago. Right now, South Korea is only listed out of 10 top most target designations. So I think we can see the recovery of economy, tourism. We call them physical recovery. But I think there is also the psychological recovery and the cultural recovery. So I think from the short-term point of view, there will be some kind of restrictions. Some people are worrying about the newer variants of the virus, like XBB 1.5. Some people are still worrying about the restrictions of other countries. So I think from long-term point of view, we are confident it will recover. But I think from the short-term point of view, we still have to face the challenge. But I'm quite confident that these challenges, these restrictions will not last long.
Mr. Biswas, are you surprised to see these kind of frictions between countries after reopening? I mean, Singapore is not imposing new restrictions on Chinese travelers.
Because of the upsurge in cases in China in recent weeks, that created, a sense of fear. But I think it will diminish. Particularly, I think that, the likelihood is that the spike in cases will fall away rapidly. And I think when other countries see that the cases are coming to low levels again, then those initial fears will diminish. So I'm not too concerned that these restrictions will last too long. And I think people will adjust in these countries where there's a sense of, maybe a little bit hysteria about the incoming tourism. But it's also very, very crucial that the Chinese tourism, will help the economies of these countries. For example, Thailand, prior to the pandemic, a very large part of their tourism industry was based on Chinese tourism. It's the same for Malaysia, for Singapore, and many other countries, particularly in Asia, for Japan, for South Korea. So I think once this initial kind of fear is diminishing, it will actually become much more widely accepted. And I don't think this will be an issue for very long. I think Chinese tourism will rebound strongly this year, and it will be a very welcome boost to regional tourism. And of course, it's just coming back to normal probably over the next 2 years. And then beyond that, as China continues to become a larger and larger economy, this has very long-term implications for the economies of the Asia Pacific as Chinese tourism continues to go back onto its growth path that we were seeing prior to the pandemic. So I'm very optimistic about Chinese tourism flows coming back to normal. I think the governments of the countries around Asia very much understand the importance of Chinese tourism. So I'm sure the governments will be, very much working to get it back to normal as quickly as
Some of the concerns we're talking about here, they go both ways, right? Professor Wu, some people do worry that reopening China's border might lead to another surge of infection here in China. What do you think?
Based on the 3 years history of the pandemic, so it's not surprising that we have another round of new infections, but it's not totally bad news. Basically, when you look at the viruses, actually, the virus, although the transmission ability is increased, but its disease-causing capability is decreased. So basically, once we come into the Omicron virus is very transmissible, but it does not cause very severe diseases. So I think this trend will continue in the future, and I expecting that in the new year, you will see more variants coming out, but the scientific evidence indicating that they are going to be getting weaker and weaker. So that actually basically leads to us to believe that we have to live with the virus. So that's pretty much the reality, as we have known such virus existing for a long time, and they keep circulating in the population and getting weaker and weaker. So I'm not surprised in the new time, sometimes will be a new wave of infections. But I think as we build up the medical capacity and the drugs and therapeutic regimen and the vaccination, we should be able to deal with that. Once the pandemic actually moves into the countryside and in the rural areas, I think this is even more critical because our best healthcare system are very much concentrated in big cities. So as I heard that many of the county hospitals still lack of drugs and medicines in deal with. The other thing is that the vaccination remains to be very important, particularly in the elderly population and the people who have underlying medical conditions.
I'd like to move on to the last part of our discussion, looking ahead. What kind of lessons have we learned? How can we better prepare for the next pandemic, Professor Liu?
Well, we have to be aware that we got to respect the nature, and also when we are living in a globalized village, and policy need to be synchronized. For example, as how we can address the COVID issue. So it turned out that no country is really making a difference, although with frugal attempt. And second, the supply chain also needs to be shaped by market forces, because it is there, the cost and also the capacity that is there to decide. And many of the governments are trying to actually to steal power from the people, from the private sector during the crisis, because they can really frighten them that you got to, huddle under my arms. So I think be careful about the government, capricious record of stealing power during crisis. And third is that we also need to further get coordinated in dealing with climate changes, with also more of the leeway for developing countries to catch up on industrialization and urbanization. And then lastly, I think more of the consensus need to be built within the multilateral framework like WTO and also regional economic framework like RCEP or NAFTA or Mercosur, etc. So that all in all, it's a small village, and people need to act in synchronization instead of going into different directions or even in conflict.
What can be done to improve the global health response coordination? I mean, some have even suggested a global pact on pandemic preparedness is needed, like the one or similar to the one we see for climate. Would that be a good idea?
Yeah, but we don't need another committee or another set of meetings. We have the WHO. The issue is you have to take politics out of the WHO. So it's going purely on the science. And this has been the problem. I mean, it's been a political football. The US has, basically been under the table kicking people at the WHO, say, you got to say something about China, this kind of thing. It is not productive. It is not a win. I mean, the biggest issue that we're having, if we want to focus out, is a trust deficit between people and their governments, and between governments themselves. So when you asked me what is a positive step, I was very impressed by Qin Gang's speech, where he said, he didn't talk about Washington. He talked about the American people and the fact that they're nice people, just like the people of China are nice. So moving away from, when the relationship between governments is very difficult, perhaps broken. I think China is trying to reach out people to people. And over the last 3 years, that's been difficult because of isolation. So I think a big part of this is getting people face to face, understanding that just because you're Chinese, you're not a monster. Because you're American, you're not a monster, right? Iranian, it doesn't matter. Everyone wants to vilify everybody. So you have to get past that point. The second part I would go into in terms of things, I just want to mention this, is this whole idea about reshoring. It's nonsense. It was tried back in the late 70s. A friend of mine's father was spearheading the deal for America to take over South America and use it as a resource bin. It didn't work. Why? Because the market, as you pointed out, suddenly said, corporations think quarter to quarter. If they can make more money switching their supply lines, they'll go there. They're not looking long term. The governments are always doing that. So what had happened? The US had to absorb a tremendous amount of losses. Banks lost a tremendous amount of money. That's where Argentina really got into trouble and things like that. So it's not going to work. The other part is, there's so much growing inequality. 2/3 of all the money that was made went during this 3-year period went to a handful of people. And that can't continue. That is also about trust. So when you talk about the medical system, it's people saying, we want governments to provide medical system, education, all right, opportunity, safety in our streets. These are the things that matter if you're actually living somewhere. It's not these bigger issues about governments trying to vilify each other. So hopefully, in my mind, that is the positive side of what 2023 could represent.
We do want to leave things on a positive note, right? Whenever there is a crisis, there also has been opportunity. So we want to take a look at what kind of new exciting opportunities would be there. What kind of new economies do you see emerge, Professor Wang?
Well, it's very hard to put names into the picture, but I will say if the government, first one is that they respect the rules of science, like they don't really divide people by their political views and debating whether to wear a mask to prevent from infection. And the second one is to respect rules of the market, and they don't let the political views to decide whether they want tourists in or not. So I would say if the government can do those two things, then they would have a better picture in 2023.
We thank you for all the thought-provoking and inspiring perspectives. I guess we can all agree the future has never been easy to predict, and a post-pandemic world is even more unpredictable. But know this, with every pandemic that happened in the past, there has been a rebirth that followed, and COVID would not be an exception.
And to you, I share the optimism and hopefulness conveyed by a lot of our guests today as we march into 2023, knowing that it's not just memories of battling COVID we're taking with us, but also hard-won victories and hard-learned lessons. I'm also excited to learn how China will continue to interact with the rest of the world and that positive role this country always strives to play on the international stage. With that, we've come to the end of our special forum today. Again, our heartfelt thanks go out to all of our guests today. Thank you so much for your profound insight and for sharing with us. And from Choya and me, thank you so much for watching.
Bye-bye.